Hello and welcome to the Outdoor Recreation Council BC, the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC's April webinar, The Science and Art of Building Volunteer Partnerships. My name is Ryan Stewart. I'm facilitating today's webinar, and I am speaking to you from the Comox Valley on Vancouver Island. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm grateful to live, work, and play on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. In the spirit of reconciliation, we have made a donation to Spirit North. Becky Scott, the Canadian Olympic medalist in cross-country skiing, founded the charity. They partner with bike and ski clubs, schools, and others to help First Nation kids access outdoor sports. You can find out more about Spirit North at spiritnorthxc.ca. Today's webinar is part of a monthly series hosted by the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC. The ORCBC represents more than 90 nonprofit organizations and 100,000 plus British Columbians. Their passions range from hunting and fishing to mountain biking and rock climbing, nature viewing, off-road vehicle use, and more. The Outdoor Recreation Council is the only unified voice for these different groups in the province. A little housekeeping. Don't worry if you're trying to keep up with note-taking. We're recording this webinar and we'll share a recording along with links and other resources by email in the next few days. After my introduction, we'll have a presentation from 3 panelists. A question and answer session will follow, and we'll wrap up things up around noon Pacific time. You can add questions to the Q&A or the chat function at any time, but I'll wait until the question and answer session to pose them to our panelists. I do my best to ask as many questions as I can. I apologize in advance if I miss any. Right after we end the webinar, a super short survey will pop up in your web browser. Please stick around and take a moment to fill it out. It helps us do a better job with these webinars and cover topics that you want to see. Okay, so let's get on to today's webinar. We have 3 guests, as I said, and they are from far more international than usual, which is the reason we're a little earlier today than typical. So they are Evald Bundgaard Iversen, an associate professor at the University of Southern Denmark. His research focuses on the interaction of recreation and governance. Today, he'll be telling us about his study that recommended ways to better facilitate partnerships between volunteer trail builders and land managers. Dr. Kelsey Johansen is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Eastern Finland's Tourism Business Water Resource Research Communities. She's also an adjunct professor in Lakehead University School of Outdoor Recreation, Parks and Tourism, and she's the founding chair of the Trails Research Hub. Based in Ontario, the hub engages in research, education, and outreach to support sustainable trail development across the country. She'll share an analysis of Evald's study and its application here in Canada. And Kevin Eskelin works with the Recreation Sites and Trails BC as the Regional Recreation Manager for the Southern Interior East region. He's based in Cranbrook. He'll help us put the research into a BC context and share details on how Rec Sites and Trails partners with volunteer groups. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand things over to Evald, who's going to tell us a little bit about his research. So Evald, I'll take it on over there.
Thank you so much for the introduction and thank you for having me over. I'll just share here, I think. Now it should be working, isn't it? Yes, all good.
Yes, looks good.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. It's always pleasant to be able to tell other people about something that you're really interested in and also to try to adapt it to other contexts. So it's really good that Other has done the hard work of adapting to other contexts. So I'll mainly talk about the study and also provide a bit of information on the Danish context to be able to perhaps situate it even better. So in Denmark, we have been working on a couple of projects that's had a focus on what you might call green infrastructure. So just briefly, we've had a focus, as we will mainly be talking on today, about MTB trails, developing and marketing MTB trails. We've been focusing on the volunteering in nature and particularly on volunteering in relation to MTB trails. But we've also have other projects with relevance for the green infrastructure. We've been looking into outdoor life in shelters and cabins. We've had focus on how conflicts in nature might influence the experience of being in nature, particularly in like forests near to cities. And we've also tried to shed light on how trails where you live might be relevant for, for example, support health purposes. And finally, we're having currently a project on outdoor fun. And just a few more words on that. It's about how adolescents might be more in nature and with a particular focus on organized outdoor activities. And the reason I mention this one is it's also highlighting how we work. So we often work in a close collaboration with municipalities, with different kind of non-profit organizations and other types of state authorities, for example. So that's who we are and what we do. And getting closer to the particular topic of today, we've had two research projects focusing on MTB trail building, providing insight into how public authorities and volunteers collaborate around MTB trail building in Denmark. So just as it's probably the case, this screen became white for me. Is it white at your screen as well? For some reason, that's not working. Here it is, perhaps. There it is. So those photos are examples of how outdoor life in Denmark. In comparison to Canada, we got much less space, obviously. And besides, in general, having much less space, we also have a lot of agriculture, a lot of cultural landscape. So it's really a challenge in Denmark to find space for outdoor activities such as mountain biking and mountain bike trails. So to be able to provide for mountain bikers to be out in nature, it's really important to have a close collaboration between landowners, the state, sometimes it's private landowners, and sometimes the forests are owned by municipalities. So that's really an essential part, and also a reason for looking more into the possibilities of collaboration around these facilities. So with the increasing interest in being in nature in general, and also an increasing number of mountain bikers being out there, one take on it has been to provide more collaboration between the public authorities and volunteers around providing this infrastructure. And it's different in the green space than in comparison to a lot of the indoor facilities we have, because there's been a historical reason for providing a lot of public funding for the indoor facilities, whereas there's not been the same tradition for providing public funding for outdoor facilities. So another reason to look into how you can collaborate between volunteers and a different kind of state officials is also because of the lack of funding that's provided to these types of facilities. So getting closer to what this is about in particular, we've looked into co-production in mountain bike trail building. So we looked into it from two sides. One side was assessing further the motives among volunteer trail builders, where the top 5 is shown here. So they're quite altruistic about their work on trails. So the number 1 is motive is to contribute to the local MTB trails. Number 2 is to provide others with good mountain bike experiences. Number 3 is to support the development of mountain bike trails meeting all levels. Number 4 is to support the effort of the local volunteers. And number 5 is to have mountain bike trails close to where I live. So actually the first 4 ones is quite altruistic in their character, but of course the last one is more like an individual motive. So getting even closer to then, how can authorities then provide for a framework that generate beneficial conditions for volunteer mountain bike trail building? We've looked into 3 municipalities. All of them had a lot of strategic focus on this area. They provided resources in different ways, and they all had what we termed compatible structures. So they all provided financial support. They all prioritized human capacity internal in their bureaucracy to be able to work in strategic ways with this area. And finally, they also had different ways of providing practical assistance to the trail builders. So that could be different kind of machinery, but also sometimes more consultant-based activities, right? So what we saw in these 3 well-functioning municipalities was that the efforts by the public authorities made trail building more manageable for the volunteers. And it also increased the possibilities of having more trails built because there was like a positive interaction between the volunteers and the authorities. It also showed that there was a risk in the cases where the municipalities to a high extent took over, that there was a lack or a less responsibility from the volunteers towards working on the trails. It wasn't like a major thing, but we could see that there is a balance, right, between making the volunteers responsible for working on the trails and taking over and providing different kinds of support. So that's a tricky thing to get the right balance between those two ideas. And we also saw that a welcoming administrative culture makes the trail building process run more smoothly. In some instances, in other areas, research has shown that the bureaucrats see involvement of volunteers as a challenge, as something that slows down the process, that's an administrative burden that makes their life harder in different ways. But that was not what we saw here. We saw a much more welcoming administrative culture. The key persons were basically available for the volunteers. They had the possibilities to make the relevant decisions. And there was in general a positive and trustful attitude towards the volunteers. So in that way, a welcoming administrative culture is important. It's important to invest in a constructive dialogue between the partners that builds trust and makes the process easier and ensures progress in the building process as well, right? And it also provides the volunteers with more freedom to take the right decisions. And that was also a thing that we saw in general, that the public bureaucrats acknowledged that the volunteers in this area were very knowledgeable and had more knowledge on how to build trails correctly, actually. So that was also important for the good collaboration, that in that way, the public bureaucrats saw the volunteers as an asset to them rather than a burden. So that was a very brief run through of what we did on this area in particular. We have made more stuff in Danish. So I don't know if you can in some way do an AI assisted translation of some of these, but you're more than welcome to try. But we have also a few other resources available in English that could elaborate further on this. And I'm more than happy to discuss and elaborate further in the next or during the session here. So thank you very much for your time so far, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Evald. Appreciate it. Let's move to Finland, where Kelsey Johansen is today. Kelsey, what did you find when you analyzed Evald's research?
My screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen now.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to basically look at Evald's study and look at a little bit of how we can apply that to a North American context and specifically a Canadian context. So very briefly, I'll put the research in that Canadian context, talk about some North American best practices, and wrap up with some takeaways for land managers as well as public authorities and for volunteer groups. So broadly speaking, in a Canadian context, we have a very different political organization compared to Denmark and other Nordic or European or even United Kingdom countries. Many of the legislation in those countries is based on the freedom to roam, and that's very different than how things operate here in Canada. In Canada, the freedom to roam is not enshrined in law. We do have what's called public access, but that is restricted solely to public lands. So those crown lands that are managed on behalf of the public, either at the federal, provincial, territorial, or municipal level. So some of the key things that we need to take away when looking at how to apply international studies to a Canadian context is how that geopolitical context influences how we operationalize trail co-production. So key takeaway is co-producing trails and other outdoor recreation assets takes time, and at the core of this process is relationship building. The process of co-producing trails is easier when both sides recognize the value and expertise that the other party will bring to the relationship, to the reciprocal relationship, and how they are going to derive equitable benefits from that collaboration. So in terms of some North American best practices, we can see that our neighbors to the south have some really positive federal level legislation that contributes really meaningfully to the way that trails and outdoor recreation assets are legislated. And unfortunately in Canada, we don't necessarily have the same federal protection for access to outdoor recreation places and spaces. But the United States has some great examples, and we can learn a fair bit about how those pieces of legislation were developed using reciprocal, meaningful public consultation and engagement. And for those of you who are following what's happening in the United States right now, there's two really potentially groundbreaking pieces of legislation before the House and the Senate at the moment that will have longstanding impact on how the public is able to access public lands for recreation purposes in the United States. Fortunately, here in Canada, we do have some really excellent provincial legislation. One example of that is the Ontario Trails Act, which was passed in 2016. It was developed and enacted through some really meaningful public engagement as a direct support to the 2015 Ontario Trails Strategy, which in turn was developed through extensive public consultation. In the period between the passing of the Ontario Trails Strategy and the passing of the legislation, we see a substantial public consultation period where we see public authorities really engaging with meaningful outdoor recreation stakeholders to determine what key issues should be included and reflected in that act. And we see some really positive steps forward in terms of building relationships, recognizing, as Evald mentioned, the importance of acknowledging the expertise on both sides of that partnership and relationship. Some other really interesting best practices that can help to support access to and development of outdoor recreation resources and assets is through an emerging practice called natural asset planning management. And this is a really interesting and groundbreaking approach that Canadian municipalities are taking to valuing and identifying resources to support natural assets. So most municipalities and other public authorities are required to engage in an asset management process in Canada, and this is because they have the responsibility to be fiscally accountable for how they use public funds. So asset management, typically we tend to think of in recreation sector as managing built assets, but natural asset management planning looks at how we can manage natural assets. So that's things like our waterways, our public lands, and our public recreation assets that are built on those public lands, those public waterways, and how we can continue to plan for their longevity from an environmental, economic, and public health and well-being standpoint in order to support the long-term sustainability of our communities and their residents. So natural asset planning looks at ways to value those assets and to forecast how positive investments in those assets can lead to increased opportunities for environmental health and for public health. And we see some great examples of this in Ontario with the release of the asset management regulation, which now has environmental natural asset requirements embedded within that regulation. And to help nonprofit organizations, members of the public sector really roll out this regulation, the Ontario government has partnered with the Natural Assets Initiative to release a guidance document. So when new legislation gets passed, it can be challenging for volunteer groups to know how to implement that legislation to the best of their ability to serve their goals and objectives. And this guidance document is a really essential part for talking about how local governments and the volunteer and nonprofit sector can work together to engage in natural asset planning. Another great example of ways in which we can adapt these processes to a North American context is through collective impact initiatives and regional trail committees. Collective impact initiatives and organizations typically work towards creating long-term sustainable solutions, typically with a focus on social, environmental, economic, and oftentimes trail-based or outdoor recreation-based problems. In this case, we might think about land access for public and outdoor recreation engagement, advocacy for conservation and preservation of landscapes and natural assets as key things that a collective impact organization with an operative mandate centered around outdoor recreation might focus on. And partner organizations in collective impact initiatives need to look beyond individual gains and have a shared understanding of the benefits of land access initiatives for all parties. Typically, collective impact initiatives will have representation from the nonprofit sector, from public authorities, and a great example of this is the Colorado Outdoor Partnership that works to identify, support, and promote solutions to the opportunities and challenges that a growth in population and recreation poses for Colorado's wildlife, waters, economy, and land. And through their collaborative work, they've really hit some amazing milestones related to the conservation and preservation of outdoor places and spaces, while simultaneously safeguarding access for public recreation. Here in Canada, we have a great example of a collective impact organization focused specifically on trails, and this is regional trail committees. These were originally initiated in Ontario through support from the Ontario Trillium Foundation and the Ministry of Natural Resources. And this was initially done as part of the Trans-Canada Trail connectivity planning and was spearheaded in Ontario by Trans-Canada Trail Ontario and the Ontario Trails Council. Since the connection of the Trans-Canada Trail, we've seen a shift in how regional trail committees are structured in Ontario, and they tend to focus now on trails above and beyond the mandate covered by Trans-Canada Trail. So that's motorized, non-motorized trail access with a collective goal or objective of strengthening trails within a specific region. I see some great examples of this, for example, in the Hastings Destination Trails program, which is in Hastings County in Ontario, the Dryden Regional Trails Committee in Dryden in Northern Ontario, and also the Thousand Islands Parkway Multi-Use Recreational Trail Committee in Morrisburg, Ontario. And these organizations are comprised of individual stakeholder representative groups like mountain biking, hiking, equestrian, cross-country skiing, snowmobiling, ATVing, who come together to build meaningful trail assets and do collaborative marketing and collaborative grant writing to support the growth and development of the trail sector in their region. Now, I know we've talked today about how we access public lands, and I know that our next panelist is going to speak a little bit more about how this is operationalized in BC, but broadly speaking, there's three sort of main ways we approach this in Canada. And one is land and water use access agreements. These typically focus on allowed and permitted uses. They're oftentimes based on zoning regulations, bylaws, and they may be governed by a provincial piece of legislation like a Land Act. And another is something like a trail or other outdoor recreation asset stewardship agreement. And these tend to focus on building a meaningful relationship between a public authority and a non-for-profit organization. They typically focus on the stewardship of natural assets like trails, other outdoor recreation enabling infrastructure like trailheads, signage, bridges, culverts, and comfort areas, and who has what responsibility for maintaining different elements of those assets. As I mentioned before, this is typically a relationship that's codified and written down between a public authority and an incorporated volunteer or non-for-profit organization. And if you're going to be striking this kind of agreement, it's really important that it outlines risk management and insurance requirements, as well as any certification requirements for individuals engaging in those stewardship activities. We might think, for example, of a chainsaw operator's license being a required piece of certification, or first aid and safety skills for wilderness locations. Also, this typically will lay out the difference between what constitutes maintenance, repairs, rebuilds, rerouting, and new construction. And I know today we're focused on public lands, not private lands, but the other form of agreement would be a private landowner agreement. And you'll have access to these slides after the presentation. So if there's anything you'd like to dig into more deeply, you're more than welcome to. I'm just going to wrap up briefly with some key takeaway messages. So taking away from what I've said today and what Evald shared about his study, the key things that governments, municipalities, land managers, and other public authorities should think about are strategic planning, financial and other supports, being responsive and available, building trustful relationships, and how to both motivate and allow for influence. Strategic planning means developing a strategic plan and updating it every 5 years. This should include natural asset management planning, and it should be updated every time your province, region, municipality updates its strategic plan. But this specific strategic plan should focus on outdoor recreation assets. And you should communicate how trails and outdoor recreation groups can align with your strategic plan and how they can support achieving your public authorities' strategic goals. Financial supports are absolutely needed in the nonprofit sector, but so are enabling supports, and those don't necessarily have to have a financial price tag. This can be something like creating the guidance documents I mentioned earlier that tell non-for-profit organizations how best to use their volunteer time when applying for grants, when trying to meet regulations under provincial regulations and statutes and laws, or how they can meet municipal bylaws. Having a designated specific person whose portfolio includes trails and outdoor recreation is also a great help, so that individual organizations feel like they have a constant person that they're in contact with, who knows their story, who's familiar with their organization, who trusts them to be dedicated and responsive in their volunteer work, and who won't micromanage them. And this really connects back to building trustful relationships. If you're going to be working with the community, try to integrate into the trails and outdoor community. And this means giving trust in order to receive trust, as well as acknowledging expertise that exists outside of your role, outside of your division, and outside of your organization. And really making sure that you're motivating your volunteer partnerships by recognizing the amazing contributions they make and saying thank you in meaningful ways, while also allowing for reciprocal influence in setting goals, objectives, and KPIs under things like your strategic plan. And some takeaways for trail associations, regional trail committees, and other outdoor recreation groups. Also pertaining to strategic planning, building a business case, developing an elevator pitch, holding informal meetings, and hosting community-wide events. Make sure you align your organization's strategic plan with relevant municipal, provincial, territorial documents. Develop SMART, key performance indicators, and develop a performance measurement plan. These will be essential in helping you build a business case for your organization and being able to tell the story of your amazing contributions to outdoor recreation in a compelling way. You'll then be able to make the case for investors, collaborators, and volunteers that will help you to achieve your strategic goals and objectives. And share your successes and your strategic goals and how you achieve them. Make sure that you can tell that business case in a short elevator pitch. This means if you happen to bump into a potential meaningful collaborator at a local hockey game, or you run into each other at a trailhead and you only have 3 to 5 minutes of their time, you're able to tell your story in plain language with a compelling narrative and clearly articulate the impact that your organization has. If you are able to successfully deliver your elevator pitch, invite that individual and their public authority to attend an informal meeting. Share informally about your organization with them over coffee. Have a really low stakes meeting and use that to cultivate and celebrate your local champions, tell the story of your organization, and think reciprocally. Oftentimes, those of us working in the non-for-profit sector get really focused on what we need in order to be successful, particularly when we're operating with financial challenges and financial constraints. But if we think reciprocally and we can explain what a public authority or other municipality or organization will get from working with us, then we're much more likely to have someone be receptive to our requests. And host community-wide events. We've got a great example coming up on June 1st, BC Trails Day. If you have an opportunity to host an event, whether it's a trail build, a skills clinic, or a fundraiser, and align it with large-scale events that are happening in your community, then you'll be able to make yourself positively known within your community. which increases the likelihood of being able to build positive, meaningful, and trusting relationships with those public authorities whose help and support you need to achieve your goals and objectives. So, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kelsey. Kevin, just before you get on to your presentation, could you just give us a sense of everything that we've heard so far? How do you see that fitting into a BC context?
Yeah, I think it all resonates and it all aligns very closely to how we've approached partnerships and particularly trail-based stewardship agreements, land designations in BC over the last 15 plus years, actually. So it resonates strongly with me, and I don't have anything contrary to say. In fact, I could spend a long time sort of reinforcing all those various points that Kelsey and Evald have made, and unfortunately don't have enough time in the presentation today, which is going to be super high level. But it's, it's sort of quite happy to see that this work that from Kelsey and Evald is sort of consistent with our land management approach. For trails and for recreation sites, working with partners in BC. So the sort of a landmark event in BC land management happened back in, I think, 2008, when we made an authorizing mountain bike trail policy to legitimize existing mountain bike trails on public land. And as you guys know, that I think we're over 95% public land in British Columbia, so there's substantial amount of trails existed at that time, and that was the beginning of sort of our current land management approaches, which have been refined over the years. And a big part of that is engaging with community groups, as I'll outline in the presentation. But absolutely, all the points made just now by Kelsey, that this aligns very well with our current philosophy and approach. In fact, we have sort of a lot of that is encoded in policy right now. Our problem is sort of capacity, because the land base is huge. Our staff, we don't have a lot of staff. And so really good pointers for, enabling partner groups to, to have that sort of reciprocal sort of thinking and a long-term plan, around their natural assets and thinking about their community and informing sector-wide groups to deal with us, the province, because that really helps, because we're spread pretty thin. So in summary, yeah, it all aligns very well with our current approaches and our thoughts on that too. Speaking for my branch.
And the natural asset management planning is that something that Rec Sites and Trails BC is sort of using as a way of thinking about the land base?
Yeah, I mean, we use different words. Like we would have recreation access planning at a community and a landscape level, and then there's sort of the higher level planning that happens at a landscape level. In BC, where we're trying to factor in recreation values into those plans, using attributes such as recreation opportunity spectrum, which is a common one in the recreation land management, speaking to the natural asset that's there. Unfortunately, we aren't able to do that as much as we want, but definitely moving forward, have those intentions of factoring in that natural asset value to land and land use planning at all scales.
Excellent. All right, well, I'll let you get on with your presentation there. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Tell me if you can, comes up okay.
Yep.
Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. How's that? Are we good?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, good, because I can't see anymore. Okay,
yeah.
So I'm going to have several slides here, but I'm going to move through them pretty quickly. It's all very high level. A lot of the participants on this webinar, I'm sure, are fairly aware of what recreation sites and trails is. And We are a branch inside the Ministry of Environment in BC. We are in a division with BC Parks, and we work with community groups in rural BC. So I'm going to skip over a lot of this pretty quickly just to set the context of how we operate, and ending with sort of how we, some considerations around working with community groups. So this is the kind of the structure of our branch, to sort of set that part of the context. Very small branch in terms of, the ministries in BC. We're looking at about 60 people, 65 people. And in the summer, we have auxiliary recreation crews, puts us up over just over 100 people. We do have dedicated staff, by the way, for trails. We have a small trails department, but otherwise it's sort of, 20 recreation districts. In each one
Hey,
has a recreation
Kevin, sorry to interrupt you. Is it possible to put you're not actually in slide mode. It's got the slideshow loaded, but not actually showing the slides big, like full screen, if you know what I mean. It works, but if you can switch it to like a slideshow, that would work better. I'm not sure if you're able to do that or not.
Okay, I'm trying. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
I got 3 screens here, so what are you seeing, Ryan?
We're seeing like a PowerPoint presentation, like when you're working on it, with the slides down the left side, and then the kind of boat with everything across the top, the full menu.
Okay, sorry about that. I was hoping I wouldn't have technical trouble.
It'll work fine. Like we can see it. It's just a little bit smaller. So if you can't figure it out, just continue on, and I think we'll be okay.
Okay, I might have to. I don't want to take too much time.
Sure.
Trying to figure out the issue.
Someone suggests just pressing F5.
F5. All right, we'll try that. Is there any change there?
Nah, don't worry about it, Kevin. Just keep going as you were going. We'll be fine.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that, folks. Anyway, I'll just continue rolling through, and sorry for this small screen. So is it changing now for you?
Yeah, we're seeing the different
Yes.
slides. Yeah.
Okay. So that's our structure, to sort of set that part of the context. Now this is about the facilities that are found in the province. And just to give you an idea about the sheer magnitude of that natural asset we were talking about, 129 trail networks, for instance. So many more individual trails that are out there, thousands, 20,000 kilometers of trail to our estimation. That's just what we're managing. There's an order of magnitude above that of what exists out there that we're not managing. This is the vision and the mission of our branch, Recreation Sites and Trails BC. So you can see that sustainable stewardship, connecting people with nature, is embedded sort of in our purpose. And the general land management approach here, as I alluded to with the facilities that were managed versus not, is that we're wanting to sort of enforce place-based management in managed sites and trails, knowing that unmanaged trails exist everywhere. We're trying to put a standard of safety and environmental standards, and consider recreation experience, managing these in a focused way on what we would call designated or established campsites and trails. And so what we don't do is the dispersed, unmanaged, or dispersed recreation that's beyond those sites and trails. And so speaking about stewardship, it is community centered because there's so many small rural places in BC, and we are engaging with community groups directly at that level, trying to enable those visions, needing to be flexible because there's various levels of capacity and vision out there. in terms of what these groups would like to see in their community. We try to help along the way build that capacity in partner groups. Try to be sensitive culturally, and there is quite a big rural development aspect to this as well. Tourism is an important sector in British Columbia. Local governments this is sort of their what they would like to see out of developing trails and campsites in and around the communities. And then the last point there on stewardship is the importance of youth engagement through these agreements. They are the stewards of tomorrow, and sort of in that place-based management regime, thinking about families and increasingly accessibility generally for all users. So that's the broad strokes, and these are the mandates that we operate under. You see right there, I've highlighted it in partnerships with communities and organizations. It's sort of in our DNA, and this is how we are able to do so much as a small branch in government over such a large land base. It's really have a strong reliance on these community organizations and civil society. We authorize construction of trails and campsites, and we work with other ministries such as environment, forests, in sort of that dispersed recreation that happens outside of sites and trails, and that would be that planning piece as well. So moving on here, we have right now.
Oh, Kevin, we haven't moved on from that slide yet. Can you bump us forward?
Is it moving now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry folks, again, wrong screen. Yeah, let me know, Ryan, if that's not working. Okay, so I spoke to this one, right? And then we talked about stewardship, and that is the mandates that we were just on. Is that working for you now?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, my apologies. Okay, so we're on to this slide here now. We have almost 400 agreements in the province right now with these types of groups, okay, largely societies in the not-for-profit world in BC, some local governments, First Nation organizations and governments as well. And so this, as I was saying, is so important to the basis of how we even go about trying to manage trails and trail networks and campsites in BC. And here's a slide on statistics over since 2014, the last 10 years. You'll see that we're just under 400 agreements provincially right now. That's just steadily increasing. And there's a bit of an indication around the breakdown of those sort of entities out there. The vast majority being what we're calling BC societies, those, the mountain bike club, the hiking group, the ATV group, the snowmobile club. So there's just a few statistics for you there. A few more specific to this region that I manage. Last year we had over 150 agreements with partner groups. So as you might imagine, that's a lot for 5 recreation officers in this region to handle. So those points that Kelsey made at the end of her presentation around being prepared, with that sort of, vision and a sophisticated approach around approaching the province is so important. And so what this little chart shows is we have an average of 3,000 partnership or 3,000 volunteers in this region last year, averaging about 40 hours each. So we're tracking these statistics and looking for trends. We're seeing generally an increase in volunteers, seeing an increase in age of volunteers, a net decrease in volunteers, but yet an increase in hours. So that one of the concerns in the background is that some clubs have volunteers aging out, and volunteer burnout is a problem. And so recruitment of new folks is an ongoing challenge in a lot of these groups. So here we have sort of my highlights on the benefits of partnerships, which some of which I've touched on already, is really about enabling groups to execute a vision in their own community, right? And they're not the same. None of those communities, the hundreds of them that we work in, they're all different. They'll have different emphasis, different capacity. It's about us trying to be flexible and in that approach. And a big part that's of this success is their ability to leverage in external funds as a society. And so we would enable and legitimize and support projects. The legitimization, by the way, is through our authorization sort of mandate, but also land designations and legislation, and as you know, forest officials, and adding to that, adding to our budgets via them at a project level. So with those benefits come some challenges. Of course, trails, particularly, very popular in communities, and everybody wants more for various reasons. Tourism is a big driver. Outdoor, lifestyles, and we have more and more pressure and demand on trails. So controlling that growth within our own program capacity is a problem and a constant challenge. The fluctuating society or civil society the capacity is a problem too. A group that might have a lot of capacity one year makes a proposal, and we work with them on a project. A couple of years later, they might not have the same capacity on the ground, and their visions might change. And there's some ownership for the province in that, in terms of the assets on the ground. Constantly educating groups and managing their expectations is a challenge too. There's some pretty passionate folks out there, and so that's an ongoing challenge. And then I would say that sort of the tourism pressure, the sheer value that this amenity has to communities in terms of tourism potential, is a pressure that we see on our branch. And one of those ways that comes through is the new applications, and that's that authorization piece. And that's a workload for our staff as well. And final slide I have for you today is just a couple points on what a successful project looks like. Lately, we've been really trying to focus on rebuilding things that might have been built 10 or 15 years ago or before that, with environmental sustainability in mind. There's more and more challenges on putting new things on our land base, various layered values, and that aren't always compatible. And so really we're trying to shift towards rebuilding recreation amenity in situ. And this final point goes to some of the highlights from Kelsey there, where if you have a project, make sure that you have a 5-year plan, right? Or a 10-year plan and a long-term vision. Make sure it's sustainable, and phased projects are really good because that enables us to align authorities or the authorizations with the club of the day without biting off too much. And so we can align with the ebb and flow of capacity in the community with phased projects, that adaptive management approach. So that's what I had for you today. And I'll end it there. Right.
Excellent.
Again, sorry for the technical problem.
Oh, no worries. It happens to us all. So thank you very much, Kevin. We'll move to the Q&A, and there was the first question there, I think, from Lexi Rosen, was asking about which point do you feel volunteer trail organizations are lacking the most in terms of their capacities? What resources or pieces do you feel is most lacking, and how could they be helped in a meaningful way? So I think, Kelsey, you were interested in answering that one to start with. So why don't we start with you and then see if Evald and Kevin have anything to add?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I appreciate the additional clarification about the perspective that Lexi was asking from. So first and foremost, what I would say is volunteer non-for-profit organizations are big-hearted, really enthusiastic lovers of the outdoor recreation pursuits that they are most passionate about, but they don't always have the capacity in terms of time to dedicate to the administrative side of things. And anything that an organization like a public authority or Trans-Canada Trail can do to reduce the administrative burden and allow those organizations to facilitate meaningful community-based events, access to public spaces for outdoor recreation is a benefit. And things like guidance documents that break down complex regulatory processes when applying for permitting, anything that explains how to write a successful grant in layperson's terms that will help to support things like phased applications. We love to talk about things like this, but we don't always say, like, what is a good phase 1 and how does that build into a phase 2 and how does that ultimately get us to our phase 3 end goal? When we think about scaffolding our funding application, when we think about leveraging our assets and resources. So any documentation that can be a 5-page simplified approach for how a volunteer member who has lots of passion, but not a lot of knowledge about regulations or funding application portals to make their life easier, and a checklist that they can verify before they submit their grant document or before they make their pitch is super helpful. As is any support that can be provided from an organizational strategic management perspective. So helping them develop a strategic plan, helping them define strategic, measurable, attainable, SMART KPIs. So we think about our key performance indicators. Oftentimes, they aren't fundamentally connected back to a strategic action, and that strategic action isn't necessarily connected back to a strategic goal, and which is in turn not necessarily connected back to our mission, vision, and values. But it fundamentally relates to, we saw a pool of money and we'd like to apply for that. So making sure that there's a key connection between each one of those levels of planning and your execution is going to be really key in helping volunteer non-for-profit organizations be successful. Because when they successfully receive funds, when they successfully operationalize a project, it galvanizes new volunteers, which helps to offset the volunteer burden, which helps with planning so that you have successive generations of volunteers growing up excited and passionate to volunteer their time and effort in the outdoor recreation sector. So hopefully that answers your question, and I've popped my email in the chat. You're more than welcome to follow up there, and I'll open it up for some more questions or some responses from our other panelists.
Yeah, Kevin or Evald, did you have anything to add there?
I could just briefly add that what we saw in our project was that it was in particular when it came to the more operational side that they could need more support now and then, right? Whereas when they worked in the innovative and establishing new trails, it was easier to gain the necessary resources to get that part going. So I would have like a particular focus on when it moves from the innovation and the establishing and moving more into the operational side. That would be a good place to look for providing more resources.
And Kevin, is that what you see on the ground when you're working with groups, that's more where you see the lack is, or the capacity constraints from them is often on that admin side?
Yeah, and I think that Outdoor Rec Council has really been helping with that, actually, and building some toolkits and yeah, so we have a real spectrum in BC around what those partner groups look like, from that small backwater town with a handful of people to an alliance of several groups with a lot more sophisticated governance and experience. And what we've been encouraging is that those ones sort of mentor some of the smaller ones. Because to the degree that a group can represent the sector or the broader, user base, that's a good thing. It builds confidence with our decision makers. And there's more certainty that the decisions and the projects are relevant. It's kind of difficult sometimes when they're very small, and And so I would say that it's on that end of the spectrum, so to speak. It's the smaller groups do definitely have. It's very common that would be lacking in their capacity. That's sort of the administrative know-how and tools to engage with, right?
All right. One of the things that caught my eye is that two of the recommendations from Evald's study and a lot of what we've been talking about today is the availability of public officials or land managers and the resources available for them to work with volunteers. That's not something that, we feel like we have a lot of control over these days, so is there any advice or tips that you have for how either someone in a land management position who feels like they don't have those resources or capacities, or a volunteer group, what can those two sides do to sort of say, hey, how can we build this up so that there is those supports for us? Maybe you want to start there, Kevin. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, are you talking about the financial support side more?
It could be the financial support, but it could also just be that having someone in a municipality that has that the authority or that single source to be able to go to. I'm just thinking about those. If I'm a trail group and I want to approach, but I'm feeling like there's no one there that I have to talk to. How do I sort of make that happen? Or if I'm on the other side and feel like I am limited, how can I sort of find that extra capacity?
Yeah, I'll just speak to it briefly. Really challenging. Speaking from on behalf of the province and our land managers, the availability of government officials is low because of how much we are doing this. Like, a given recreation officer in our branch, there's 20 of them, will have 10, 20, 30, 50 agreements. There's not a lot of time. So to reiterate some of the pointers there, to the degree that the proposal is sophisticated, refined, phased, and I guess what I can add here is if that approach is shared by others, like if they have the support of local First Nation governments, local governments, if they all see themselves in that proposal and can collaborate, then that is going to be a little bit more of an obvious priority for the government officials to attach to, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Versus the one-off, one over here, one over here. So, some organization in around okay, who is available to share this vision? Who's available to share the success and risk with us? Let's talk to our local governments. Let's talk to our First Nation governments. Let's get together on having this more comprehensive shared vision. And then that's sort of it makes it more of a natural priority. And it's easier to spend more time on a project like that, if you will. But it's not a perfect equation either. We have our own capacity problems.
Evald, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, building on from that, in our study, we found that the type of co-production present was to a high extent based on what we call co-initiative, meaning that a lot of the initiative comes from the volunteers, right? And they had like a lot of competencies. So quite a few of the strategic plans actually came from the volunteers themselves, and they kind of presented that to the public authorities. So in those instances where you have some strong competencies in regards to developing strategies and putting them into writing and also illustrating them, I think that could be a place to start also from volunteers group, making their case even harder to resist from the municipality or the public entity that's on the other side. But of course, sometimes it just comes down to basic funding also in the public administration, obviously. But to start off with a strong strategic plan from the volunteers could make it a hard case to resist from the public entity, right? To provide some kind of resource, at least to provide a dialogue.
Kelsey, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say both of the co-panelists' suggestions really align with my perspective, which is that collective impact is going to be the best way to achieve positive outcomes for the outdoor recreation sector. When smaller volunteer non-for-profit organizations come together and form something like a regional trails committee or a regional subcommittee of something like the BC Outdoor Recreation Council, then they have an opportunity to pool their resources, their human resources, their financial resources, their volunteer hours, and it creates a wonderful environment where everyone can inspire each other, where a shared vision can emerge. And then that shared vision can be receiving the backing and support of multiple stakeholders. And then that single collective impact entity will form a relationship with a public authority. And it minimizes the amount of back and forth time. You know, the public authorities also got time constraints, also got fiscal constraints. If they can fund a single collective impact organization that pushes those funds out to smaller regional organizations, if they can support the development and ratification of a regional outdoor recreation or trails master plan, and then have smaller component parts of that achieved at the discretion and direction of those volunteer non-for-profit organizations, then that can be a really positive way to have a collective impact for those organizations to have support and pooled resources, and to minimize the administrative burden on both public authorities and the private non-for-profit sector. So I would say that that's a really positive way to move forward. And we are in a climate where we're trying to do with a lot less and still achieve our wonderful goals and objectives for outdoor recreation. So I think collective impact is the positive step forward for most of us.
Yeah, looking for those shared opportunities to have shared visions with multiple people sounds like a good path forward. And I know it's that we had a question here about you know, people with diverse abilities, and I know Kevin, you could probably speak to this, but we're running out of time. But the idea that along with those like maintenance and improvement, that opportunities to have you know, that accessibility or other aspects that bring more to a community is a real focus, I know, with rec sites and trails. And so we are almost out of time, so I'll just have one last quick response from each of you. Just wondering if you can kind of touch on anything that you think is like the key pieces of takeaway for today for people. You know, what are the one or two most valuable things volunteer groups or land managers can do right away to improve their relationship, their co-partnerships? So Kevin, you're up. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, no, thanks, Ryan. Well, I would say to the degree that they can be prepared with a longer term vision that addresses sort of some of the things that I pointed out, you know, the safety, the environment, sustainability, but also like, you know, solutions and projects for everybody. And you know, many of those that are on this webinar, I'm sure, are existing partner groups with the province. One of the things I would recommend for those folks is review your partnership agreement, because what happens is these societies, they have a turnover every year, maybe new directors, and the elements of the stewardship agreement itself, and you know, the commitments and responsibilities, the reporting requirements, etc., are kind of lost pretty quickly in that sort of in the memory of the society. So there's always, you know, we're always encouraging people, okay, review the partnership agreement. The information you're looking for is in there, and this is, and it outlines how you can best engage with, you know, their recreation sites and trail staff. So that's also an important one that I would highlight.
Excellent. Kelsey, you want to add a little thought there of your own?
I would say really important to build off of what Kevin said is that review those stewardship agreements, but also think about your private landowner agreements. So not just with your public authorities, but with your private landowners, because those will be something that's lost in the institutional knowledge transition as well. And then be sure that you're cultivating the next generation of volunteers so that there isn't a massive amount of volunteer knowledge and organizational knowledge that's lost if people are getting to the point where they want to retire from their volunteer corporations and volunteer engagement, or are getting burnt out. The more volunteers you have, the stronger your organization will be and the better longevity it will have.
Excellent. And Evald, I'll give the last word to you.
Sure. I would aim for like an early and deep dialogue that provides trust between the different parties, and that is really essential. Once you have that trust established, a lot of good things can happen in the ongoing process. So if you can get to that part where you have a trustful relationship between each other, then a lot of the other things becomes a given almost to some extent.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. I will just quickly share my screen one more time. All right. Yeah. So thank you all for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. And thanks everybody in the audience for coming out and watching today. This webinar is part of a monthly series. The best way to find out about May's topic and stay up to date on the Outdoor Recreation Council is by subscribing to the newsletter. The easiest way to do that is to surf over to orcbc.ca. We'll be sending everyone that registered today an email with a link to the recording, along with key takeaways and resources and the slides. And as a reminder to please stick around for the survey. It's a great place to let us know about anything you wish we'd cover today or any topics you'd like us to tackle in the future. The survey will load right after I stop talking. So thank you all very much. Thanks for coming. Everybody have a great rest of your day or evening, as the case may be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.